Well, thanks for joining us, Barbara. So, hostile sexism seems to be a pretty obviously negative attitude towards women, and benevolent sexism, on the face of it, looks to be a pretty positive attitude. Now, it seems like a bit of a contradiction to believe in both, but the research shows that they're quite, people who believe in one tend to also believe in the other. How's that possible?
So you're right, hostile sexism, whether directed towards men or directed towards women, seems like a fairly negative attitude towards people of that gender. If we concentrate on just women, it's a belief that women are incompetent and inferior to men, and it's based on this notion of women being inherently very competitive or trying to usurp men's power. Benevolent sexism, at least on a surface level, looks very positive. It's full of positive connotations towards women. It looks very much like chivalry. And the person who holds those attitudes can feel very positive about themselves because they only wish well towards women. They're trying to protect them and trying to look after them. But I guess once you go beyond the surface, you can start to see that it has its roots in the same sort of ideology that hostile sexism does, in that it comes from a fundamental belief that women are inferior to men, and therefore in the context of benevolent sexism need to be protected because they're inferior and can't cope without men by their side.
So one of the interesting things about the research on benevolent sexism and hostile sexism is it's not just men who believe in these things. It seems to be also that, to a large extent, women have similar levels of belief in hostile and benevolent sexism.
Yeah, so when you look at mean scores on the hostile and benevolent subscales of the ambivalent sexism inventory, you can see that often you get a gender difference in scores on the hostile sexism subscale, so that men typically score higher than women. But when you look at scores on the benevolent sexism subscale, it's not that unusual not to get a difference. So women endorse these statements to the same degree that men endorse the statements. And that's probably related to the subjectively positive tone of those statements. They're saying nice things about women and their relationship with men. And so it's not unusual to get equivalent scores on that subscale.
And are these sorts of beliefs sort of, specific to a particular cultural background, or is there evidence that they're fairly common around the world?
There was a large-scale study done that sampled over 15,000 people from 19 different countries, and what you see there is there are obviously variations in the level of endorsement of hostile and benevolent sexism, but the two subscales always remain positively associated, so people who tend to endorse hostile sexism also tend to endorse benevolent sexism. And in fact, the level of hostile and benevolent sexism were associated with the level of gender inequality in the country. So these do tend to be pretty prevalent beliefs, with some variation obviously in mean levels, but they are prevalent in a wide range of cultures around the world.
And probably, the most important question, what effect do they have on people? If you really believe in benevolent sexism, how's that going to affect how you treat people?
Well, it's a curious thing. So, obviously, I think if you think about hostile and benevolent sexism, how can you reconcile, if you like, both loving and hating women simultaneously? And I think this occurs mainly because people tend to subtype women and direct their different forms of prejudice, their hostile or their benevolent sexism, towards different subtypes. So when we look at the research, and certainly the very early research in this area, we saw that hostile sexism was really directed towards women who were challenging men for power in society. So people like feminists and career women were particularly negatively evaluated by those who endorsed hostile sexist views. And we see that come through in the research since in terms of outcomes. When we look at benevolent sexism is related to positively endorsing groups like housewives or women who don't overtly challenge the status quo in terms of the gender hierarchy. Because both hostile and benevolent sexism actually feed into that sort of legitimising ideology which keep women in an inferior position to men. So when we look at the behavioural effects of hostile and benevolent sexism, hostile sexism looks like pretty much any other prejudice that we could recognise. So it's related to negative evaluations of those women I just spoke about. So it's related to negatively evaluating women in the workplace, particularly when those women are challenging for higher or management positions within those workplaces. But more recently, we actually also see that hostile sexism has some quite negative implications for men. So there's been a great deal of work done recently looking on relationship implications of endorsing hostile or benevolent sexism. And men who who endorse hostile sexism tend to be less satisfied in their relationships. They have a more antagonistic view towards their partner, and generally they're quite unhappy because of their fundamental beliefs they have about women and what women are trying to do, which is essentially take their power away. I think also when you look at the effects of hostile sexism in terms of experiencing that as a woman, if someone is hostilely sexist towards you, it's very easy to recognise that it's a form of prejudice or it's a form of sexism. And what we see in the literature is that women obviously feel quite angry about that. They can immediately attribute this to being a form of prejudice. They get angry about it. And it actually results in some cardiovascular reactivity, but it's like a flash fire. So it comes and it goes pretty quickly. What we also see is it also motivates women because they recognise it very quickly as a form of prejudice to engage in collective action. So while it may build their uncertainty about their group and make them feel quite uncomfortable about the fact that women are being discriminated against, it actually motivates them to actually do something about this inequality they see in society. So hostile sexism, because it's quite blatant and quite easy to identify, can actually have quite a motivating impact on women when they experience it. Benevolent sexism, on the other hand, is a bit more difficult because you're actually faced with someone who's saying something quite positive towards you, and yet there's an uneasy undertone that actually the bigger implication of what they're saying is less than positive. And because women have more trouble in identifying it or attributing it directly to being a form of prejudice, or this person is discriminated against me, that causes longer term effects. So in terms of cardiovascular reactivity, they have a less intense reaction to it, but it's a slow burn. It takes longer to recover from. And that's really because it's kind of ambiguous, am I reacting to something, or is this person just being nice, or are they being prejudiced towards me? So it's a slow burn reaction. And when we look at the research that's looked at how women cope in the workplace when people are benevolently sexist towards them, we can see that it causes them some confusion. They suffer an impact in terms of self-efficacy, in terms of their confidence or about their competence, but it also impacts in terms of things like mental intrusions. They feel confused about what they're actually encountering. So it has a more insidious and long-lasting effect, which is really difficult to counter because, of course, this person's just being nice to you. We also have seen that there's been a whole bunch of research done on the effects of benevolent sexism in relationships. And so there's been a really nice longitudinal study that shows that women who are in relationships with men who are benevolently sexist actually then tend to alter their own personal level of benevolent sexism to match their partners. But what we can see is that when that woman has a high level of benevolent sexism and the relationship starts to go wrong, obviously that's more confronting to her and less pleasant because all her ideals about what a relationship should be have gone out the window, and so it can have more long-lasting harm for those individuals.
So to sum up, it can basically have like a pervasive effect on people's interpersonal relationships, but then also how they treat work colleagues and just generally perceive the social world. Absolutely,
because you can't clearly attribute it to saying this person is clearly saying something very negative and very nasty about me as an individual. It has that kind of underpinning effect whereby you're a little bit uneasy with this individual. Are they being nice to me? Are they being nasty to me? And it can undermine all aspects of your performance, which of course just goes towards the greater will of benevolent sexists, which is to keep women in the place, and that is inferior to men.
Thank you.